Thank you everyone for joining us for this session that will be running until about 4 o'clock, in which we're diving into the Global Biodiversity Framework. This morning you might have heard Patrick Odier in the opening session speak about action on nature is moving from how to what, focusing on the systemic change towards nature-positive economies, and in particular, of course, looking at the role of financial institutions, both as a lever, but also as a trigger for change. In this panel, and I have wonderful panelists that I'll introduce to you in a few seconds, we're going to zoom into the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and in particular also on the outcomes that took place in Cali, Colombia, which was the first gathering of the COP since Montreal when the GBF was agreed. We gathered there under the thematic of peace with nature, and the Colombian presidency had the ambition of making this the People's Cup. And I think with nearly 1 million participants in the green zone, I think they really overachieved on that goal. But they also worked towards a whole of society approach with, we had 1 or 2 FI participants at COP14, then we had a few hundred at COP15 in Montreal, but I think we had over 1,000 in Cali. And to make this session a little bit more interactive, I would be curious to know by a show of hand, who was there in Cali? So we see a couple of hands going up, and I think that's great to know, but it also shows that there is a lot of people here who might want to learn more about what happened in Cali. So a few outcomes of the negotiations have been the establishment of the Cali Fund on digital sequence information, and you might wonder what that is. Help is underway. We'll organize a webinar on that topic next year. Next to that, there is also the establishment of a new permanent subsidiary body for indigenous peoples and indigenous communities and people of African descent. Over 40 updated MBSEPs and nearly 120 national targets, but also relevant developments on health, which of course is very interesting if you might be an insurer, the link with climate and peoples. So today we're going to dive in with my panelists into what are the outcomes from Cali and how are you approaching that within your organization, looking really from your different backgrounds. We want to make this an interactive session, so I have a colleague who will be walking around with a microphone. In case you have a question, you can raise your hand. I want to introduce my panelists by asking them a quick question, and as so much is happening within the nature finance space, my question to them is, what are you most excited about? So I want to start with you, Deborah. You traveled a very, very long way to get here with us, and you are the special advisor to the Commissioner on Biodiversity and Inclusive Insurance for the California Department of Insurance. So can I ask you to quickly respond to the question, what are you most excited about?
Thank you, Romie. I'm so pleased to be here today. I think I am most excited about having the opportunity to discuss with these panelists the opportunities for leadership and partnership and innovation around biodiversity and social justice and insurance.
Great, super. And I'll continue with you, Susanne Pedersen. You are the Director for the Science and Knowledge Center at IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature.
Yes, that's right. Very excited to be here. And in terms of GBF, I'm definitely most excited about the enhanced role of IPLCs in the GBF, what you said, creation of the new subsidiary body and program of work, because IUCN has helped to broker this, as it gives IPLCs a seat at the table, and we believe that this is really needed to ensure equitable benefit sharing. Thank you.
Super, and I'll continue with the next person in the row, Lisa Eichler. You are the head of physical risk and natural solutions at MSCI. What are you most excited about at this moment?
Probably it's the energy that you get when attending these types of conferences, maybe not necessarily because of the official outcomes, which can be disappointing, but mainly because you see the drive behind, especially the business and financial sector, and the interest in contributing to a solution and a positive outcome.
Super, thank you. And then we're going to Saori Takahashi. I hope I pronounced that well. You're Manager, Sustainable Management, Corporate Strategy Group at Norinchukin Bank.
Hello, everyone. I'm very honored to be here, part of this panel. Thank you so much for the introduction. What I'm really excited about is the fact that actually there is a progress from Montreal to Cali. From my perspective, I was not there in Cali, but at the same time, I was in Montreal experiencing the movement was happening, just born at that time with a group of businessmen as well as the financial institutions firstly participating in the Global Biodiversity Framework discussions. And later in Cali, it seems the number increased, and I'm also particularly interested in the state of nature, sort of the metrics discussion is, starting to happen, and those are little by little progress that we are making is something that I'm very excited about.
Thank you so much, Saori. And then coming to you, Paul, you are Sustainable Product Innovation Lead at the Bank of Ireland. What are you most excited about?
Well, I'm a banker, so I don't really get excited. But I'm encouraged, even though the financial outcomes of Cali were overall disappointed, I think that the unprecedented numbers in the financial sector who attended is a positive. And I also think the Cali-Baku pledge, which the Network for Greening Financial Institutions has beefed up the teamwork, the analysis, and the collaboration across the central banks. And probably that means that sooner rather than later, we'll see regulation and reporting obligations on banks, which will, again, accelerate the financial sector involvement in nature.
Wonderful. Thank you for your inputs. I was, of course, hoping that all of them would say that the most exciting thing was UNEP FI's Global Roundtable, but we'll settle on these answers as well. And I think it gives us a lot of things to unpack, from metrics to indeed regulation and also engagement of indigenous peoples and local communities. I want to come to you with a question. First, Deborah. So CDI was the first agency in the US looking at climate change, and I think you're doing a same approach now on biodiversity. So I would be very curious to learn a little bit about your work, and in particular also linking the title, because you look both at inclusion and biodiversity, and I think often we consider those as separate, but I think they're very much connected. So we're happy to hear from you. How do you incorporate that in your role?
Yeah, actually, I think that this morning, one of the speakers also mentioned her understanding of human rights expanded to include climate and human rights, and I think that you really can't consider climate change, biodiversity loss, or social justice separately. They're intricately intertwined and related. And we have planetary boundaries that we need to live within, both in terms of climate and biodiversity. And we have people that we don't want to let drop off or suffer. And the people who will suffer the most from climate change and biodiversity loss are those most vulnerable, the poorest, the ones with fewest resources. And that's where insurance really comes in, because we know that insurance can build resilience and can enable people to bounce back after a disaster. And so there's a feedback loop here that I'm trying to fill in terms of linking those three items.
Great, super, thank you so much. Paul, I'll go to you at the end of the row. I think you're a bit unsuspecting it that I would go. In the previous panel, Laurent Verstandig of the Nature Conservancy spoke about the need from moving from millions to billions. If we look at the global biodiversity funding gap as identified in the GBF, this is 700 billion annually, and it's a lot more than any of us will have in our bank account, but it's equivalent to the GDP of Switzerland. In your role focused on product innovation, you're looking into scalable solutions. Can you tell us a little bit more on how you're working on that within your role at the Bank of Ireland?
Yeah, well, I'll update you on the figures because Bloomberg New Energy Finance are talking about a 942 billion gap. So, sorry to put a downer on the panel at the beginning, but that's the reality. So it's not improving. In terms of what we do in the bank, the key learnings, I suppose, that I can share with you in terms of the designing and developing and delivering innovative products. I think that there are 5 key areas. The first one is around the fundamentals of price, value, and asset. And you know, at a time when we're trying to encourage private capital to flow into nature, it's very important to understand that capital doesn't flow without a price signal. And people would say that you can't put a price on nature, but the price on nature is currently 0 because it's a public good. And that's intuitively wrong because nature has a value. So if the approach that we take is we look at the value created by nature as expressed by ecosystem services, and this is why natural capital and natural capital protocol are so important. Because if you can take an ecosystem service and you can value it, that creates economic value, which creates the price signal and prompts the flow of capital. And that's something that we've successfully used. And I think that if you focus on ecosystem services, it unlocks opportunities in PES and all different types of innovation. The second point, and the previous panel alluded to this as well, is around embracing imperfection, which, according to my wife, is something that I'm an expert on. And that's really about the acceptance that when you're innovating products, they're going to evolve and improve over time. And indeed, some of the earlier iterations of stuff that we've put out into the market have been improved with the introduction of new standards and data sets. But it's also important to have the space to be able to innovate as well. And that leads me on to the third main point, which is around collaboration. And I think it's hugely important to generate new products with reference to all stakeholders. So typically, we'd liaise with the scientific community, with NGOs, and academics, and the public sector. And they all have red lines. And the idea is you plot their red lines, and there's a space in the middle, and that's the space that you can innovate. And just a couple more points, really. The next one really is the amount of standards and frameworks. I think there's 19 different frameworks that I read. That's far too many. And if ever banks needed an excuse not to do anything, it's to point to the number of frameworks and say that they're confused, or they're keeping their powder dry and seeing which one comes to the fore. And I think that's a delay that really we can't afford. So I would be a big advocate of TNFD. I think it's really the only game in town. It's going to be the only game in town. They have IBAT, they have Encore, they're linked into, they're aligned with GBF as well. So I would be, as I say, I would promote that. And lastly, I suppose, if you look at the response to the corporate world to the signing of GBF, you saw an uptick of, I think, over 40% of corporates started reporting on their biodiversity, and for banks, the corporates are your customers, so there's a clear opportunity there. I'll leave it at that. That's the top 5 anyway.
Super, thank you so much, Paul. And I think indeed, perfect is always the enemy of the good. I think when we look at different tools and frameworks, UNEP FI has published a report called Accountability for Nature, in which we compared 7 leading approaches on 14 indicators. And for those that like that report, we will be updating it again in January, also adding an additional chapter that dives a little bit deeper into the topic of pollution. In the previous panel, I think BBVA spoke about one of the examples with their water footprint loan. You spoke about some of the lessons you learned from early product development. Do you have, for those in the audience who might be new to the topic, an example of some of that imperfect work so that we can make it a little bit more tangible for them?
Well, the first one that comes to mind would be a product called the Woodland Nature Credit, which we developed, and the idea behind that was really to securitize the ecosystems services that were flowing from forests, which were going to be established. So, specifically, we looked at carbon sequestration. We looked at biodiversity uplift and amenity value, because these forests were going to be open access. And whilst the carbon sequestration piece was something that was very easy to, well, it wasn't very easy, but it's more straightforward, I suppose, to calculate. Biodiversity uplift caused quite a lot of discussion as to the standard that we would use. And whilst we actually decided on one standard, we were looking at this most recently for a further issuance. We've issued 7 million euros in Woodland Nature Credit to date. I think we'll be looking at a different standard. So that's a case of evolution and making something fit for purpose.
Wonderful, thank you, Paul. And the reason why I'm asking for examples is that I think we need experimentation, but at the same time, financial institutions, it's not necessarily a sector that loves experimentation as much as other sectors might do. So I think it's important to share those examples, because you can learn from what others are doing and picking up that way. Saori, I'd like to come to you with a question. Norinchukin is a special bank because you're a cooperative agricultural bank in Japan. Sorry, English isn't my first language either. Can you tell us a little bit how you have integrated the GBF targets into your bank's strategy?
All right, thank you. Norinchukin Bank, as explained correctly, very perfectly, is a cooperative bank of Japan, and established in 1923. So we just celebrated 100 years anniversary last year. And because we're cooperative banks, we receive deposit from farmers, fishers, and lumberjacks, and accumulated assets of 100 trillion yen, and also half of it, which is going to be 50 trillion yen, is under management. And just to give you a lot of background to elaborate on how the GBF is connected to our strategies and a core value, there are two transmission channels we're exposed to. The first is through our the stakeholders that include the 500 cooperative banks spread around Japan. And they also receive deposit from farmers, fishers, and lumberjacks. So the cooperative banks are also dependent on nature, and they're exposed to nature-related risks. The same structure applies to us. So the Norinchukin is exposed to nature-related risk via the cooperative banks and the farmers and fishers and lumberjacks. So that's the first transmission channel. And the second transmission channel is us being an institutional investor with an asset of 100 trillion yen. We invest in diversified assets and also lend money to general corporates, including the those that are listed at the Tokyo Stock Exchange, and also that some are rather middle-sized, I have to say. But those are the exposures, the second exposure that we have through the investee corporations as well as the the borrowers. So we have to care about the two sides of the transmission channels, but having the farmers and fishers and lumberjacks as exposed as the very important stakeholders, we care about the nature-related risks and opportunities that are, that could potentially be coming back to us. And that is why we set the purpose dedicated to sustaining all life. And also we set the vision of 2030, contribute to the goal of nature positive, which is almost the equivalent of GB, I have to say. So that is the core value that all workers, officers of Norinchukin Bank share as a core, and we operate as an institutional investors as well as bankers. And we face our stakeholders, and we care about them very much. So in order to strategize the vision and the purpose that we have, we send a representative. Hirotaka is a TNFD member, so we would be happy to follow, what would be the recommendation of TNFD is published. And there are two aspects of the strategies that we would like to highlight. First is the risk analysis, and the second is the financial mobilization. First of all, we have been doing an in-depth risk analysis in terms of the nature-related risks with the academic institutions. For example, the Waseda University, the Professor Itsubo, who is working on the nature footprint analysis. And the research group established this model called LIME. And the model can go all the way down to the portfolio exposure to the nature degradation, namely the extinction of species. So we analyzed with a group of researchers in terms of exposures to the footprints, nature footprint, and the potential extinction risks over portfolios. And also we did analysis in terms of supply chain of a portfolio with a focus on food supply chain, namely the packaging meats. And we sort of concluded that our portfolio has an exposure to American beef sectors and the resources that the farmers in America are relying on. And in terms of the financial mobilization, I have to stress that we, as someone else in the previous panel highlighted, there is a contribution by IFC as well. We invested in IFC-issued green bonds, which focuses on Brazilian forestry industries, as well as the one of the proceeds also goes to, as far as I know, is the credit, biodiversity or carbon credits related topics. So we are very proud of doing something really positive about nature, but it really relates to our also the financial risks and opportunities in the longer term. As I explained, that goes all the way back to GBF's target, that is also related and coming back to our own financial materiality as well. So we're, having a very dynamic purposes and also the materiality, which we're all proud of, And we're all dedicated to the activities that are targeted to GBF as well. And not only that, in the way forward, I would like to also highlight the transition planning activities has just begun within our community of TNFD and then also the G funds as well. They're upcoming the papers that are focusing on transition planning activities of financial institutions, focusing on, in addition to climate, but nature. So I would like to stress 3 points, areas of improvements that I would be critical to our operations. First is the target setting activities. And the second is the engagement. And the third is more financial mobilization, as Paul highlighted. The pricing needs to be there as well. So all the way back to GBF, there needs to be the target setting activities based on the target 15. Clearly emphasizes the importance of target setting, and also the the financial institutions needs to know what will be their impacts and risks and opportunities and dependencies around nature. So the target setting activities is something that we believe would drive to not only the the people in Norinchukin Bank like me, who is everyday working in sustainable finance, but also the front office staff that are actually becoming a more pump to be able to have a tool to have a conversation with the clients and also the investee and an asset management firms. We are collaborating together. So the target setting, based on the PRB guidance, I think the target setting needs to be actionable and pragmatic so that the front office staff will be able to operate upon it. And that's the first point. And the second aspect that I would like to highlight is the engagement based on the target setting, probably. And the engagement is something that's, providing us the opportunities to provide finance to the clients and borrowers, and at the same time reducing risks of clients, basically. So I believe that is a critical and a very important, very, proactive and progressive, and also the, not only doing, it's all about the having a partnership with the clients, and also the based on the engagement that is hopefully the positive, so that the clients are able to find the way forward, and also are able to actually transform their business to something more sustainable and nature positive, so that the target ultimately will be established all the way through the the entire portfolio of our Norinchukin Bank. And finally, the financial mobilization aspects is something that we expect needs to happen more. And as I already told you, we have already made some investments, activities, but at the same time, we're eager to sort of identify the specific technologies and opportunities, and also the locations that are also positively working together, hopefully with us, so that we're able to move forward and think through really what will be the necessary tools and technologies to really make the transformation and transition happen in a specific location. And making the partnership together with them will be something that we're really willing to do together. So pricing needs to be there, and a public-private partnership in terms of the, incentivizing the financial sectors would really go into the analytical sphere of a specific location, as well as the clients and investees, so that we are able to crystallize our all-together effort to something nature positive, I would say. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, and I think it did much more. It was a very rich response. Thank you, Saori. And I think before I go back to you with a small follow-up question, I want to say that I'm extremely pleased having you, but also on the previous panel, a speaker from MS and AD, because there is a lot happening on nature in Japan. I think you're leading as TNFD adopter, you were leading as downloader of the TNFD materials, and I think due to language barriers. If you're not a Japanese speaker, it's sometimes hard to see these developments, but it's incredibly encouraging how your country is leading on this topic. I'm very happy to see that you're picking up our PRB target setting guidance, and you might have seen, and for those that haven't seen it in the audience, that we also created more specific sector guidance for mining and agriculture, so that's additional to the materials we launched about a year and a half ago. And then what I really liked in your answer is how you're embedding action on nature across your organization, including for front office staff, because this is not something for the sustainability department, this is something for the entire organization. So I think that's very important. I want to come to you with a small follow-up question, because I know whilst you now work for Norinchukin, you worked for the Japanese government in the past. The GBF speaks about this whole of society approach. Do you have any recommendations on, how can we converge from the public to the private space in a more common language to really make sure that we can take action now?
I have to say, it's always good to have, multiple angle sort of understanding of a specific issue. When I was working for, financial regulator in Japan, I definitely have to think about this one specific issue from a, angle of a financial regulator. But we're always, I also, at the same time, my fellow colleague at the FSA as well, we're trying to, see the same thing from the angle of businesses, for example, and also the financial institutions. And we're all trying to find a common language, as you explained, or I wouldn't necessarily say that is something that we need to compromise, but at the same time, learning from other perspectives is something really important, not necessarily mandating, not necessarily coercing something that's so powerful. It's really important to have a constructive dialogue and a collaboration all the time with the, the financial institution as well as the businesses. And Japan is always good at having that kind of conversation all together as one. And, every country has their own path to way forward, but at the same time, from my perspective, I think it'll be critical. And TNFD is performing in that form at the same time, which I'm really happy about as well.
Thank you so much, Saori. I think we're moving to another side of the stakeholders with Susanne, working for the IUCN Science and Knowledge Center. We heard already about the Live in Planet report and the 73% reduction of the population of vertebrates since 1970, but we haven't heard so much from the IUCN Red List yet. You worked a lot in the climate space. I would be interested to hear, what type of work is IUCN doing in the context of the GBF, and how do you take your climate knowledge on board on leveraging action?
Well, thank you. Despite progress at COP16, we feel that there were definitely various areas that were not properly addressed, like national ambition and implementation, and finance mobilization. On the national ambition, as you rightly said, only 44 of 196 parties actually submitted their revised NBSAPs. We acknowledge, of course, the challenges faced by the parties, given that the GBF really calls for unprecedented transformation of our societies and the contribution from all actors and all sectors. We also recognize that this complexity has made it difficult for countries to really set targets. In our work at IUCN, we have tried to support countries to address these challenges through capacity building, provision of global data sets and tools, for example, the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species, as some of you may know, the Red List of Ecosystems typology, but also our sort of co-ownership of IBAT, where you provide country profiles that can be used to develop targets and indicators, conduct spatial planning, and monitor the status of species and protected areas. But a strong monitoring framework is also needed. And in the climate world, you do have the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement, and on the CBD, you have the monitoring framework and global review, which is essential to keep the GBF on track and enabling us to identify the need for additional actions, but also to hold all actors accountable. And to ensure credibility and correct reporting, the monitoring framework should build on science-based methods and data, which is what we definitely stand for. And on the finance side, the mobilization, I think we all know that we are falling far short of mobilizing the millions and the trillions and all that needed for implementation. And the same, when it comes to directing investments for transitions in societies in harmony with nature, GBF calls on businesses and financial institutions to disclose their impacts on biodiversity. And we do need that because there's a risk that ambiguous disclosures, which are done mostly for reporting or compliance purposes, can create a false sense of progress while really failing to reduce the actual negative impacts on biodiversity. And in the climate space, there are requirements to measure your impacts. And IUCN collaborates with partners such as TNFD to strengthen the disclosure frameworks. And we've also developed the IUCN measuring a nature positive approach, which will help companies develop rapid, high integrity contributions to the GBF and align with the LEAP process of TNFD. This nature positive approach will use the global data sets of IUCN and co-opting the extensive experience of IBAT, the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, which can help companies measure their impact on living nature, that is species and ecosystems, and it will also help them decide where to take action. Our approach is also aligned with initiatives like the Nature Positive Initiative, and it can help businesses and financial institutions measure the net outcomes of their activities relative to conservation goals and decide what actions need to be taken where. Altogether, we do need concerted efforts for climate and biodiversity, given the interdependencies of biodiversity and climate challenges. For instance, we do need to leverage opportunities to integrate nature-based solutions into NBSAPs for both climate mitigation and adaptation. And while many countries are already incorporating NBS related to forest, agriculture, and so forth, there's room for additional actions in key ecosystems such as oceans, wetlands, and peatlands. And at the same time, we do need to address trade-offs between climate and biodiversity actions. For instance, I think it's clear to all that there are evidence that even the best climate mitigation projects, such as deployment of renewable energy, reforestation, electrification of transport activities that are necessary for the green transition, can actually still potentially have adverse impacts on biodiversity. So we do need to screen for impacts on nature as well. And IUCN work with experts all over the world to provide that guidance to businesses on maximizing the positive synergies between climate and biodiversity action while managing the risks of trade-offs. We also work with the CBD Secretariat and individual countries to address the climate and biodiversity crisis as two sides of the same coin. So in other words, we need to consider the interlinkages to ensure a fast implementation of GBF. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susanne, also for this very rich answer, and I think you presented so much of the work that IUCN is doing. I think things like IBET, the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, which really gives you that location-specific information, but also your work with TNFD, piloting the BETA framework with indigenous peoples organizations, I think has been a very crucial importance for the TNFD recommendations and how they're now presented to the market. Lisa, you've been waiting for a long time. I'm interested to hear from you because we've been looking at MSCI research that says there's been a 50% increase of biodiversity labeled funds across the financial markets in the past year. At the same time, we've been talking about how do we then measure that biodiversity component in there. UNEP FI, together with Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, we released a discussion paper, Finance for Nature Positive. So I'd be interested to hear from you, what do you see, because you have a lot more data than I think all of us combined, and also how do you work on creating a common understanding on what these biodiversity labeled products mean?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And just for those of you in the audience that don't know MSCI, I mean, we are probably most known, of course, for our index and ESG ratings business, but we also really, of course, really look at the data, the underlying data and models. And this is where, you know, nature and biodiversity really has been becoming a more and more important topic over the past years and a key focus on our side. Maybe in my response to your question, I'll try to kind of summarize also and bridge across a little bit, you know, the specific question, but also the outcomes of COP16 and also kind of the many challenges and conversations that we have around the world with the financial sector, you know, from pension funds to sovereign wealth funds, insurers, and so on, banks, and you know, what are the challenges and maybe a key focus on these next steps to implementing the GBF, but from the financial sector side, what can we do and where are our challenges? And I think in that context, like, you know, the kind of things that we see as key use cases for data, for metrics, and so on, is on the one hand, I mean, reporting, you know, the early adopters of TNFD, CSRD in Europe, and so on, but also engagement, of course, how, you know, what metrics can you use to have meaningful conversations with corporates and also to encourage what data points to monitor, how to assess progress, right? Because that is really a challenge if you want to set targets. And on the other side, I mean, of course, maybe the more advanced use cases on data, also how to integrate this into investment processes and what are the nature opportunities. So with that in mind, I kind of have three key points that I would like to just briefly talk through, and hopefully kind of also that you can remember to take home, because it's always a lot, these kind of sessions at events like this. But so on the one hand, the nature focus is really fast-tracked. Like, I think this has been highlighted in this panel, but also at COP16 over and over again. I think we shouldn't underestimate, yes, there's no standardization yet. Yes, you know, we are all struggling how to do this, but the frameworks and regulations are, you know, piggybacking a lot on climate. Because we also cannot achieve any of these or beat any of these challenges, whether it's climate or nature, without tackling the other. So it is really a fast track, and we shouldn't underestimate it. Even just to give you one point, at the COP16, you know, the TNFD adoption already breached the 500 mark, which was definitely a much slower uptake for the TCFD when that came to place. And yeah, and then so basically don't underestimate, and the expectations, I think, on the financial sector will be speeding up. And I think I really like Paul's point, which I also wanted to make, you know, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I mean, this is about getting started, right? Nobody has the perfect data, nobody has the perfect coverage, nobody exactly knows what are the perfect targets to set. So just get started. And maybe to give you a concrete example of that, how we have been also trying to support clients over this past year is especially the LEAP approach, right? Can you please help me how to locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare? And there are so many data points, what to use for what type of use case. Is a biodiversity footprint good to use? How do I measure my financed land use and water consumption and so on? So this is really kind of where we have been learning a lot also together with clients, I have to say, in supporting this track, and that is really important, because if you do the LEAP approach and you assess your portfolio, it's almost like finding out, okay, where do you currently stand, right? And where do you want to go from there? How can you use that to inform also your target setting if you are on that kind of mission to set targets? So nature fast track, that's point number one. I think point number two, and maybe with the, in brackets, comment of no matter how disappointing the official negotiation outcomes, are, I think for the financial sector, really investment in nature is an opportunity, and a big one, right? And we shouldn't underestimate this. And I think typically we look at, the risks or, whatever kind of prevents us from getting into something new. But nature is an opportunity. And we really see growing demand for financial products on nature, biodiversity bonds, nature-themed funds, or nature-themed custom indexes, what to use to drive those. And then also, and this was covered a lot and highly visited, all the events also in Cali, on nature-based credits. Nature-based credits is like carbon credits, but that don't only have the kind of emissions offsetting context, but also kind of additional benefits on nature, so nature protection or restoration projects or sustainable use projects. And just to briefly zoom into that as a nature kind of investment opportunity. So because like you said, we have lots of data, so we also have data on the carbon markets. And I think it's really interesting to see and to know that, for example, already now 2/3 of project origination, so new carbon projects, carbon offset projects being developed, 2/3 of those in 2014 are nature-based projects, right? And this means we breached 14 billion in investment in this project creation sometime in Q3. I don't have the latest numbers, but 2/3 of that is into nature-based projects. And also around 50% of the credits that are retired, so bought by corporates, this year are from nature-based projects. And I thought, yeah, that's an interesting one also to highlight. So nature is an investment opportunity. And then my third point and trend that I've been picking up from these conversations and also lots of the events in Cali is location, location, location. So while the biodiversity crisis is obviously global, the impacts and risks are felt very locally and different depending on the location. And what does that mean in the financial sector context? So of course, that focus means that we need solutions that are tailored to the local situation, and we need also the rising need for kind of geospatially explicit data. So it's not enough anymore to know what's happening in a sector, a region, or a corporate on the corporate level. You need to be able to drill down to the specific asset locations. Where does the corporate operate, and how does that interface with nature? And yeah, so while actually many of the data points and data sets and initiatives that are publicly available have already been mentioned, for example, you were mentioning the IBET database. There's also, of course, the WWF Biodiversity Risk Filter, the Natural History Museum data, and then there were two very exciting initiatives launched also in Cali, one by the TNFD on a global kind of nature data facility, and one by the Finance for Biodiversity team on a data platform. However, and this is where we kind of see also everybody should do what they're really strong at, and you should partner. So where we really see our strength is to then bring this to the financial sector. Because one of the biggest questions I always get in conversations is like, that is great, geographically explicit, nature impact data, but how do I know where my portfolio is located? Right, and so that's kind of where we have been putting a lot of our own emphasis on, is to have a large corporate asset location data set that then in turn enables and unlocks a lot of these data sets. And starting with where I'm also very proud and happy to announce this, or we were able to announce this during COP season, is our partnership with the WWF, where we are unlocking, so to say, the biodiversity risk filter data for all the locations, of corporate issuers, which means, all the large indexes and the companies involved there, for example. And I'll keep it at this because I know we're also running short on time.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And I think on the credit markets, my only addition to that would be that these biodiversity credit markets need to develop with integrity, and that's why we helped to set up the Biodiversity Credit Alliance together with UNDP. Before I go to the audience with one question, maybe two, I quickly want to go back to you, Deborah, because I know that you do so much rich work in California. So if you can come back to me with a bit more explanation on the different teams where you're working on.
Absolutely. It's okay? Okay. Yeah, thank you. So I just wanted to take a moment to highlight 3 themes. The first is the idea of adaptation as transformation. We spend a lot of time thinking about how to protect assets and structures and things, buildings, homes, possessions. But I would suggest that we take this moment of planetary crisis as an opportunity to really question some of those values and disrupt the status quo and seek a more regenerative and more balanced relationship with the world. Second, I think we really need to think about centering indigenous knowledges and leadership in all aspects of this work. The deep experience and wisdom that has been passed down from generation to generation, and a relationship with the planet that is based more on balance and integration and less on extraction can really provide a whole new framework for how we think about biodiversity and climate and how we think about adaptation. And third, focusing on what kinds of adaptation strategies can be designed with the affected communities as opposed to over the affected communities, and ones that incorporate ecosystem restoration and gracefully coexist with natural forces like water, like fire. And all of this requires a new vision of leadership. So it's been mentioned several times now, the creation of the subsidiary body at Cali of the indigenous peoples and people of African descent. I think that that's a fantastic first step to opening up real dialogue. I would also note, I'm from California. California and other subnational entities are not part of COP. But I think that we can really provide a tremendous amount of leadership. So over about 10 years ago, California and the state of Baden-Württemberg developed the Under 2 MOU, and this was a memorandum of understanding between the two states to really think about how they could tackle climate change. That memorandum of understanding has grown now into the Under 2 Coalition, which has 176, I believe, 178 members. It's the largest coalition of subnational entities addressing climate change. So I think that that's a really important model for us to think about when we're talking about biodiversity. And finally, there's private industry. And working with the insurance industry, I can see that they have an increasingly important and visible role in both reducing risk and increasing resilience. So in California, we've been really thinking about specific pilot projects that we can develop to address fire, flood, and heat, ranging from creating an urban forest insurance product to creating a state fund that will ensure prescribed burn, which we know is beneficial and important on the California landscape, to community-based parametric microinsurance to address flood. And so all of those are on-the-ground projects that we are either in the process of developing or have already spurred. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Deborah, for those rich examples. And unfortunately, although I've been speaking about questions, I see that time is running out. So I want to thank you all for your participation, for your attention. If you have a question to me or one of the speakers, please try to come to us after the session. So let's join in with a big applause for the speakers.